guest lecture as part of our ongoing lecture series on Nordic-China relations, various areas and dimensions. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Mark Lantain. I'm a senior research fellow here at NUPI, specializing in Chinese foreign policy as well as Greater East Asia, diplomacy, political economy, and non-traditional security. We're here today, though, to welcome a very distinguished professor from LSE, London School of Economics, Professor William Callahan, who will be speaking this afternoon on the various aspects of the Belt and Road Initiative. Used to be very commonly referred to as the One Belt, One Road, but we were given very specific instructions by various authorities that the proper name for it is the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. Quite a bit has been discussed about the Belt and Road over the past few months. It is probably one of China's most ambitious areas of foreign policy for quite some time. It is certainly a departure from other areas of China's cross-regional diplomacy. And there's been a lot of debate over what exactly the end product of it is going to be. Certainly, we can look at the various maps, various documents relating to it, how this is going to improve Chinese trade, how this is going to have an effect on China's economic relations with many key parts of the world, including Russia, Central Asia, including Africa, and certainly including Europe. A lot of debate in Europe right now over what Belt and Road is going to represent. How is this going to affect Europe, the continent, Europe, the economy, as well as individual European economies and governments. Right now, President Xi has just arrived in Poland. He has been very active in diplomacy in Eastern Europe. This includes, for example, the 16+1 initiative, which has brought together China as well as many Central and Eastern European governments to talk about closer relations, with the Belt and Road likely being a major player in this. But what about other parts of Europe? What other parts of Europe are going to be affected, and how? And how is this going to affect Europe's overall foreign policy? So Belt and Road, even though on paper it is very much an economic endeavor, there's a lot of politics involved. There's a lot of foreign policy involved, and you can even argue there's quite a bit of strategy involved. So to provide an overview of what the BRI represents, not only from the China viewpoint, but also from the viewpoints of outside of China, it gives me great pleasure to introduce this afternoon Professor Callahan. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark. Is the mic okay? Good, super. Thank you, Dr. Mark Lantain, and Bjornar and Ren and everyone for inviting me to give a talk today. I guess what is fun about working in London, and especially at the London School of Economics, is that people think that you're important. Whether you are important or not is something else entirely. So a lot of officials from foreign countries want to come and talk to us. So I meet with lots of official delegations. This time last year, I had a delegation of the top Taiwan studies people from mainland China who wanted to come to the LSE. Why did they want to come to the LSE? Can anybody think? Why would the Taiwan studies people want to come to the LSE? The president of Taiwan is a graduate of the LSE, Tsai Ing-wen. So they wanted to come, and I thought they wanted to talk to us about our Taiwan studies and what we think. They said, no, we want to know what sort of mentality Tsai got when she was in the law department. And unfortunately, I couldn't help them because I didn't know anybody in the law department, but it was very interesting that they were very, in a sense, strategic about what they wanted from the LSE, and often they're disappointed because we're not the experts that can give it to them. I met another delegation, a bunch of us, including Bjornar, met a delegation last January from China. This delegation of about 8 people, some very senior officials, some senior academics, were sent to London to find out what the British people thought about Xi Jinping's One Belt, One Road initiative. And as Mark said, the first thing they told us is, no, we don't call it One Belt, One Road anymore. We're calling it the Belt Road Initiative. And that, I think, tells you a lot about how, so this was supposed to be diplomacy, it's supposed to be give and take. They're supposed to be listening to us to see what we thought of the Belt Road Initiative, but the first thing they told us is that we got the name wrong, even though they had given us that name. So it shows a certain uneasiness in diplomacy in China, in their outreach. And so the BRI, I guess Mark already told you a little bit about it. I'll repeat, I guess, that it's Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy project. He's invested an enormous amount of capital, political capital and financial capital, into this project. And on the one hand, as Mark said, it's an economic project. It's to build a huge infrastructure network to link China with Europe, Central Asia, and Africa. So most people see it, and it's also, so it's about building infrastructure, but as he said as well, it's also about launching new multilateral banks, particularly the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRICS Bank, New Development Bank, and the Silk Road Fund. So it's seen as a whole package for economics to sort of, China says, we can do it for you. We're good at building bridges. We're good at building railroads. We will and we'll fund it too. So it's seen as a kind of a package for development and infrastructure development in particular. So most people think of it as an economic project, which is designed not just to help other countries, but to deal with China's internal problems. Because China has a lot of overcapacity specifically in cement, steel, and construction industries. And even these new multilateral banks aren't just to help out other countries. They're a way of in a way, getting Chinese money out of American treasury bills and into something else, to diversify China's foreign exchange portfolio. But my argument is that it's much more than economic. And if you listen to influential Chinese scholars, they're much more bullish about what the project can do. They argue that, I'll call it BRI. I'm tired of saying BRI. I like BRI. I don't know whether I'm allowed. Maybe somebody will tell me I'm not allowed to say that, but I like it. BRI and AIIB, according to a lot of scholars in China, and not just the radical ones, the mainstream scholars, these two banks are designed to challenge the current world order, to dethrone the Washington Consensus, and to use Chinese ideas to build what they see as a better and fairer world order, whether you call it the Beijing Consensus or the Chinese world order or something else. This BRI project fits into the Beijing Consensus very well. So last January, I decided to give them, and Bjornar can back me up on this, I thought I was giving them a very easy question. I said, who is right in Beijing? Who is right? Those who say that BRI is designed to enhance the current system, just to help people out, to build more bridges and railroads, who could be against that? Or those who were trying to overthrow or saying that we need to have fundamental changes in the international system. And what was interesting is what I thought they would just say, oh, it's just meant to help out people, it's not meant to challenge anything. But what was interesting is how this question struck a nerve. And it wasn't just one person who told me that I was wrong for even asking the question. It was 2 or 3 people. Even the one guy who didn't speak English was the head of the delegation. He said, I have to say something. In the meantime, the meeting was coming to an end. I had to go across campus to teach a class. And they wouldn't let me leave the room until I had the correct understanding of BRI. So that told me a couple of things. They think it's very important that everybody has the right understanding of BRI, but also it told me that they aren't really sure what the right understanding of BRI is, because even as they were telling me I'm wrong, the foreigners should not see this as a threat, it's only an opportunity, often they very quickly went and say, well, the current international system doesn't work that well, it's sort of corrupt, we don't like it, so we really do need to change it. So there's a lot of slippage in the public discourse about BRI, and it often goes from these very cooperative ways of understanding it to then these ways that are challenging international order. So what I'll do today is sort of follow some of the arguments about how China is trying to do new and different things with BRI. Not necessarily challenge the world order. You can judge whether I'm over-interpreting the text or not. And I guess I should say that I guess I'm well known for doing wacky things of watching movies and using them to interpret Chinese foreign policy. Today, I'm being very conservative, and I'm using mostly Xi Jinping's speeches and mostly reports from official Chinese agencies to talk about BRI. At the end, I'll talk about how some of these public intellectuals are discussing it, but I'll highlight that this is public intellectuals, it was not an official source. But I guess I'll argue that these public intellectuals are saying more or less the same thing as Xi Jinping. I'm not going to go through this. This, I guess, is just in case I forget something. So what my point is that I'll be exploring official and semi-official sources in China to argue that BRI is not merely an economic project, but also hopes to leverage China's economic strength to pursue political, security, and even cultural goals. In other words, BRI is an expression of China's new grand strategy. And I think that China's new grand strategy is to be a normative power, to stop being just a rule taker, but also be a rule maker. So how does Europe fit in? To me, it's interesting to think about China's bid to leverage economic power into normative power, because that's what the EU and kind of European countries have been trying to do for a while, for 50 years or so. Indeed, one of the interesting things about EU-China relations is that both China and Europe are best understood as an ongoing project rather than some stable identity. So when we talk about Canada, we more or less know where Canada is. We don't have to think about it. Maybe there are some separatist things going on occasionally, but that's not necessary. You know, you can look on the map and say, oh, that's Canada. But for both China and Europe, it's never quite clear where they are and who they want to be. There's a lot of discussion and debate about it. Both the EU and China are trying to turn economic power into political power, and both frame these arguments in very moral terms, that China and the EU are both involved in sort of a global moral project. It's not the same global moral project, but that's how they see themselves. In Europe, leaders wanted to solve the problem of war, we're often told, through economic integration, which has now led to social, political, and even cultural integration. And as the EU started to spread east after the Cold War, it employed the logic of conditionality and the promise of economic prosperity to induce countries like Poland to make moral improvements. So, for example, outlawing capital punishment. So there's a big conference in Oslo this week about, down with capital punishment, down with the death penalty. That's one of the things that you have to do to join the European Union, is to get rid of the death penalty. It might not be a radical thing in Norway, but in places like Poland, it was a big deal, and they're actually trying to go back on that. So this sort of this moral notion of integration, much more than economic integration. And in Europe, in each case, people use this spillover logic, where it's assumed that closer economic ties will inevitably lead to closer political ties. China, of course, has also been a target of Europe's socialization policy, and Europe has similar goals in China as it has had with its Eastern European neighbors, namely to promote a market economy, democracy, and the rule of law. And Europe and other Western countries have been pretty successful. Since the 1970s, the People's Republic of China has been socialized into the global liberal order. That China is an active member in all the major international organizations. But what is interesting is that even with all this economic and institutional contact between China and Europe, there hasn't been much spillover into closer political and cultural ties. Around 2005, there was a lot of hope that China and Europe would start working together really closely. If you remember what was happening in 2005, the US and the UK had invaded Iraq. People were really pissed off with America and George W. Bush. It was a perfect opportunity for lots of countries to kind of come together against this kind of militarist version of America. And so to me, it was quite interesting that even with all of these opportunities in 2005, it didn't happen. And since 2005, as far as I know, people in Europe and China no longer talk about shared values. They might talk about shared interests and economic interests, but not shared values, as they did around 2005. And this is not just in Europe. Outside Europe, this kind of hot-cold relationship is known by some as the Asian paradox, where Beijing has warm economic relations with its neighbors, that a lot of its neighbors actually rely on China for economic prosperity now. But at the same time, there are often China has cool political relations with Japan, South Korea, and many Southeast Asian countries. So today what I'll explore is whether this socialization shoe is now on the other foot. That we always assume the West is going to socialize China. Well, actually, what happens now that China is big and strong and powerful? What happens when China tries to socialize other countries, including Europe? And socialize Europe into Beijing's own preferred view of the global order, where China is not just the top economic power, not just the top military power, but the top normative power. Curiously, we'll see how China is trying to employ a similar neo-functionalist spillover logic as Europe did in the 1950s, that Beijing trusts that closer economic ties, especially those generated by BRI, will inevitably spill over into closer political and cultural and moral ties. And I'll trace how this strategy in Beijing tries to leverage China's economic power to build a network of new institutions like AIIB, inspired by new ideas like the China Dream and the Community of Shared Destiny, to pursue new projects like BRI, and that all of these things together, the institutions, the ideas, and the projects, are meant to knit together Eurasia, so Europe and Asia as one unit, into a tight network of economic, cultural, and security relations. So if you follow this argument, you would see this is a grand strategy, and this is an ambitious grand strategy, and that the goal is not just hard power, not even just soft power, but this moral power, this normative power that will build what some of us call a Sinocentric community of shared destiny. First in Asia, but this will eventually, if it works in Asia, then China will use it to make Beijing a normative power that sets the rules of the game for global governance for the whole world. Okay. So to understand how BRI presents a new normative order, we need to look at how Chinese foreign policy making works, just very briefly, and especially how Xi Jinping is changing it. So Xi Jinping became China's leader in November 2012, and very quickly it seems that he decided that China's foreign policy was seen as a problem. It wasn't working, and that he needed to fix it. And so what Xi Jinping has been doing over the past 3 or so years is trying to fix the problem of Chinese foreign policy. And to lay out his prescription for fixing the policy, he gave 2 major speeches, one on peripheral diplomacy in October 2013, and the other on general foreign policy in November 2014. And both speeches were about both style and content. Both speeches stressed the need for greater coordination for a more comprehensive foreign policy. That seems like an obvious thing, but obvious to Xi Jinping, Chinese foreign policy was not coordinated and it was not comprehensive. And he was responding to what he saw as the problems of his predecessor's era, the Hu Jintao era, whose weak leadership had encouraged infighting amongst different bureaucratic actors, with each pursuing their own narrow special interests. And Chinese foreign policy at the same time has become much more complex. That in 1970, China had relations with only about 50 countries. Now it has relations with every country in the world except for about 20 that have relations with Taiwan. And since China's foreign relations now deal with much more than just traditional diplomacy of kind of high politics, its foreign policy needs to attend to economic, cultural, and security issues in order to be comprehensive. So comprehensive, or Chuanmian, is another one of the key words for Xi Jinping, both in domestic policy and in foreign policy. And Xi's new objective is that foreign policy should be not just comprehensive, but proactive and strive for achievement. Proactive and strive for achievement are new keywords for Xi Jinping as well. And these, of course, are very vague terms, but for a lot of us, this has marked the end of the era of Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping, if you didn't know it, his policy was not to be active, it was to be reactive. His policy was not to go out and be the leader, it was to what we call bide and hide strategy, focus on economics. I mean, he was he and Bill Clinton had the same idea. It's the economy, stupid. Don't try and have political ambitions. Xi Jinping has actually changed this quite dramatically because he has re-centralized power, he has focused on political as well as economic issues, and he's being proactive rather than reactive. And the goal for Xi is to coordinate diplomacy according to a grand strategy that is informed by China's national interests. Xi's speeches also contain lots of new ideas about how China can become preeminent in Asia over the next 5 to 10 years. The goal of peripheral diplomacy actually is to, quote, realize the China dream of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So at first we thought this was a very vague thing, sort of nationalism that's just trying to attract people or get Chinese people emotionally. But now this sort of China dream has become a real policy objective. As we'll see, the China dream, or realizing the China dream, has become or BRI is, the goal of BRI is to realize the China dream. Let's see. According to Xi, it's necessary for Beijing to deepen its friendly relations with neighboring countries, first through economic cooperation. In September 2013, China offered to set up the AIIB to finance regional connectivity projects. And then very quickly, the following month, in October, in his peripheral diplomacy speech, Xi Jinping went on this economic strategy to suggest that China also needs to build close security ties in Asia. And that's quite new. China hasn't really been a security provider, except for North Korea, for anybody, especially in East Asia. And then he also went beyond economics, went beyond security, to say that regional cooperation must expand to include, quote, shared beliefs and norms of conduct for the whole region, unquote. In other words, we need to think beyond the material measures of hard power, like military might and economic ties, to consider how China sees its rejuvenation in terms of soft power. Beijing is on a moral mission to improve the world through its ideas, aspirations, and norms. Xi thus stressed that China seeks to socialize regional countries by developing shared beliefs and norms that will build what he calls the, quote, community of shared destiny. Now, I'll come back to that again and again. I won't actually describe what he means by it. We can, if you have questions about that, we can deal with it in the Q&A. But this very vague notion, community of shared destiny, has become really important in China and something we need to keep an eye on. So I think these shared beliefs, at first, are very not surprising. They're very familiar to students of Chinese foreign policy. They include mutual respect, mutual trust, reciprocity, equality, and win-win cooperation. So it's very much a Westphalian notion of nation states as equal, and we should be friends, we shouldn't go to war, that kind of thing. But we also need to see how the shared beliefs also include, increasingly include traditional ideas of a Sinocentric regional system that some people don't call it the peripheral diplomacy speech and policy, they call it the neighborhood diplomacy and neighborhood policy speech. But that's not the way, I mean, that's the way it's sometimes translated, but that's not the meaning of the word Zhoubian. Zhoubian means periphery. And when you start talking about a periphery, you're assuming that there's a center. And this shows that Beijing sees China at the center of this new regional order, while neighboring countries are at the margins. And often when the Chinese diplomats get upset at a press conference, they let it slip that they say, you know, there's a difference between big countries and small countries. And we're a big country and you're a small country. And this is China's diplomats and scholars are now in conversations. I've gotten this from a bunch of interviews with people who have close relations with Chinese diplomats. They say that often the diplomats invoke China's historical and hierarchical notion of the tributary system to their neighbors. They tell their neighbors that, wasn't the tributary system great? You know, we had 500 years of peace. What they don't necessarily realize is that not everybody liked it, and there wasn't a lot of peace either. But there's this notion in China, in the popular consciousness, but also in the diplomatic corps, that the Chinese Empire was peaceful and Europe was warlike, and so why wouldn't everybody like to have this Chinese imperial model? And it's not just these academics, these kind of crazy academics who I talk to who say things like this. Increasingly, it's the diplomats who use this language. And they see it as the tributary system as a benevolent model for regional order in the 21st century. So they're not just talking about history, they're talking about let's learn from China's history. The community of shared destiny thus provides an alternative moral order for Asia and eventually for the world. Here, Xi is going beyond seeing connectivity simply as the hardware of infrastructure projects to consider how China can use connectivity to influence the software of global governance's ideas, norms, and rules. Interestingly, this normative ambition grows out of Xi's reconsideration of the concept of interdependence. In one of his speeches, Xi Jinping started talking about independence in a new and different way. Now, if you don't know much about Chinese foreign policy, China's leaders and academics generally see interdependence as a problem, as a risk. They want to have economic globalization, but they really don't like political and cultural globalization, which they see as westernization and sort of human rights diplomacy. But rather than seeing the outside world simply as a political threat, in Xi Jinping's speech, he thought about how China, how globalization can actually, how Beijing can benefit from a more nuanced notion of globalization. Rather than the West simply socializing China with liberal values, he was arguing that China can socialize the region and eventually the world with Chinese values. So again, he's switching from this reactive notion, Deng Xiaoping's reactive notion of like, whoa, we want economic globalization, but not political globalization, to a proactive thing saying, we can make this globalization stuff work for us to kind of get Chinese ideas and norms and values out to the world. In more concrete terms, Xi Jinping aims to eat his cake and have it too, because in the same speech, he also made some interesting comments about the relation of development and security. And what he's trying to do is integrate China's international development agenda with its security agenda. Now, previous leaders like Hu Jintao kind of switched back and forth. So in the mid-2000s, China had a charm offensive. It was very nice to its neighbors. It was very effective. Then starting in about 2009, China became much more assertive militarily in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. And then we expected China to go back to a charm offensive, and it sort of has with BRI. BRI is often seen as the second charm offensive. But I would argue that Xi is actually not going back and forth between development and security, that he's actually integrating them, integrating development and security goals. And you can see this, I call it sort of a guns and butter strategy. It's a dual strategy. It was exemplified in the past year or so by two high-profile activities that went on at the same time. First, China has been kind of proposing the AIIB and then founding it in January of this year, and it included 57 members, including Norway, as founding members. And second, at the same time, China has had a massive land reclamation project in the South China Sea. To me, this is quite interesting because it shows both island building and institution building. The AIIB's institution building demonstrated that China is a new player in global governance, while its island building in the South China Sea actually provoked serious security competition with its Southeast Asian neighbors, Vietnam and the Philippines, and also the US. So rather than understand these two factors as contradictory, which is how most people understand them, we should understand them as a complementary pair. That the diplomatic strategy is to enmesh neighbors into a web of win-win opportunities that raises the cost of confrontation. The hope is that Beijing will be so successful that it will be able to unilaterally define security issues in the South China Sea, to turn the South China Sea into a Chinese lake, because other states won't be in a position to protest. Okay, so the China Dream, I haven't talked about it much, but in a paper I'm writing, I'll give more details. The China Dream is clear about what the PRC's aspirations are, and Xi Jinping's diplomatic strategy meetings and speeches set out important policies, especially Beijing building a community of shared destiny, first in the periphery and then for the world. But how will China achieve these ambitious goals? It's one thing to say you're going to do something. It's very hard to plan how to do it. As we've seen with the Belt Road Initiative, which will be funded by the AIIB and the Silk Road Fund, it actually knits together ideas and institutions to integrate Europe and Asia in a Sino-centric community of shared, this is from the official National Development and Research whatever report, said that the BRI is supposed to knit together a community of shared interest, destiny, and responsibility, unquote. For Xi, BRI is the concrete means for realizing the China Dream of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. As this map that I got from Merrick's shows, the geographic space of BRI starts from China's periphery, but goes far beyond this to encompass most of the world, okay? So we usually think of BRI as dealing with here and then this corridor and this Southeast Asia corridor. But what was interesting is that in the past 6 months or so, people as far away as you can get in northern England are talking about how BRI can work for them. Okay, and that's when Xi Jinping came to England last October. He didn't just go to London. He went up to Manchester to talk about the Northern Powerhouse and what China could do. So it's a very kind of flexible but ambitious project. And as I said, an opportunity to develop the north of England. What is also interesting is if you look at the documents of Xi Jinping's speech on peripheral diplomacy and put it alongside the official documents on the Belt Road Initiative, you'll see that they have very similar values, namely that they're open, inclusive, and win-win for balanced economic cooperation. The goals are likewise, BRI's goals likewise mirror those of peripheral diplomacy, which are policy coordination, facilities connectivity, unimpeded trade, financial integration, and people-to-people ties. BRI thus seeks to leverage China's economic power to address a series of economic, political, and security challenges, both domestically and in the foreign sphere. BRI thus is more than hard power, and even more than soft power, because it's increasingly framed, as I keep saying, as a moral project. This is where I'll go away from Xi Jinping and start talking about public intellectuals, some of whom are very powerful, who go to the halls of power in Beijing once a month to kind of tell them what to do. So where am I? Many Chinese public intellectuals see BRI as a cultural and moral alternative to what is seen as the corrupt and ineffective world order that they call American hegemony. According to many, the new Silk Roads will not just join economies, but join the two civilizations of China and Europe. This is, I think, what Bjornar is writing on, so I'm kind of maybe stepping on his toes a little. A scholar named Zhao Lei, who works at the Central Party School, which is where a lot of the ideas of kind of Chinese officialdom come from, he stresses the importance not just of economics, but what he calls cultural economics. And he thinks that this new cultural economy is the key thing we need to understand about BRI. and Bree's key role in China's what he calls China's civilizational rise. So it's no longer a economic or a political or a military rise, it's a civilizational rise. And Zheng Yongnian, who he works in Singapore, but he's the guy who goes to Beijing once or twice a month to tell them what to do. He's very influential. He just wrote a book about China in, I think, 2030, has a whole chapter on Bree. And he sees Bree as an opportunity for China to use its civilizational ideas to guide the values of what he calls the post-American global zeitgeist. Wang Yiwei, who's a much younger guy, he's very vocal, he's on TV all the time. He's from Renmin University in Beijing. He likewise sees Bree as the key to China's normative power in the 21st century. He's written a whole book on the Belt Road Initiative. It's going to be coming out soon in English, he tells me. And he looks at the Silk Road as a positive alternative. So again, he sees the West as bad, that globalization is actually a globalization of Western imperialism. And the Silk Road, historically, he uses it as a positive alternative to sort of Western-led globalization. He argues that Bree offers a superior model of globalization because, quote, the Silk Road was a road of friendship and prosperity, a road of exchange and mutual respect, unquote. Actually, if you look at the history of the Silk Road, it was a road of bloodshed, okay? It was most integrated and most effective during when the Mongols were in charge, and Mongols are most famous for killing the most people in the world, I think. But anyway, he doesn't see that part of history. According to such commentators, these public intellectuals, Bree will help to spread around the world the benefits of traditional Chinese civilization and the China model of development, which will, quote, create new standards of globalization. China's superior culture, what they see as a superior culture, therefore is seen as a resource that will reshape the rules and norms of international institutions. As Wang explains, Bree uses the Silk Road dream to realize the China dream, which will lead to the world dream. The goal of Wang and others may sound far-fetched, but I argue that it's actually not that different from Xi Jinping's various statements about the necessity to use China's traditional civilization and its socialist model to change the norms and rules of global governance. And I hope I've shown how China's new grand strategy to be a normative power grows out of a linkage. It's not just ideas, it's not just propaganda, but it grows out of a linkage of these new ideas like the China Dream, new policies like comprehensive diplomacy, and new institutions like the AIIB, and new initiatives like Bree, that they're all knit together, and that's why they're important. The plan is that these elements will support each other through the connectivity of physical infrastructure as well as the connectivity of institutions, ideas, and norms. How much time do I have? Okay. It's my last section. I'll go back to EU-China relations. So what about Europe? Usually in EU-China studies, we ask, how does China fit into EU policy? Today, I'll switch to ask, how does Europe fit into Bree? And I'll also switch from asking how Europe can socialize China to see how Brussels and Oslo and other European capitals will respond to and work with Beijing, a Beijing that's trying to socialize Europe. How do you respond to China's socialization policies? Well, it's common to understand Chinese foreign policy in terms of geopolitics and U.S.-China relations. I think it's important to explore how Europe's normative power impacts China's futures and vice versa. In many ways, as I said at the beginning, Europe and China are very similar. Europe faces many of the same problems as China. The threats of Grexit from the euro and Brexit from the EU are expressions of kind of deeper and more enduring questions of identity and security and territoriality in Europe, which we can also see in China's dream of a transnational community of shared destiny, which is all kind of always put beside China's nightmare of national disintegration. So at the same time that China is talking about spreading out into Central Asia and the rest of Asia, China's really worried about cracking up, that Tibet and Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia will just sort of break apart. So it's these dreams and nightmares. And that's, of course, what's, we'll see what happens after Thursday, the vote in the United Kingdom. There are also shared concerns about migration, terrorism, and extremism, which I think are related to the challenges that both countries and regions share about just simple things like a graying population. Just the demographics in China and Europe are not that good, and which often leads to a rise of populism. Indeed, the neighborhood policies of both the EU and China are facing serious challenges. And if you look at the documents, the diplomatic documents, the official statements between EU and China whenever they meet, you'll see that the diplomats are actually working on these shared concerns. They've been working on them for a while. Indeed, the main advice from European think tanks is that the EU needs to have a more unified and better resourced China policy, which is part of a more unified and better resourced foreign and security policy. The EU thus needs to better leverage its status as the globe's largest trading bloc to develop more robust political security and normative power. And again, China is trying to do the same thing. China also feels like it's punching below its weight, that it's an underappreciated power, and is likewise trying to leverage its economic might into political security and normative influence. But of course, the EU and China are pursuing similar goals in quite different ways. As my presentation today suggests, the PRC is investing a lot of time and resources into building stronger state institutions at home and a more integrated economic, political, and normative network abroad through BRI. This is part of Beijing's stress on building a multipolar world, which is the way they criticize what they see as the hegemony of American unipolarity. Beijing, I'm going to pause for a picture.
Great.
Got it? I study propaganda, so I know you have to have a good picture. So Beijing is, when it talks about multipolarity, it's always criticizing the US and what it sees as American hegemony and unipolarity. And my argument, this is probably a controversial one, is that Beijing treats the EU the way it treats other states. That Beijing treats the EU as a pawn, and a pawn in China's struggle with the US. That the EU and Europe are a pawn in this grand geopolitical and geomoral struggle with Washington. And while many Europeans are happy they do not have direct security interest in East Asia, like they don't have to worry about Taiwan, they don't have to worry about the South China Sea, they don't have to say anything about Tibet if they don't want to. This actually means that in China, that China does not take the EU seriously as a security actor. This is what my Chinese friends tell me, that be careful what you wish for, because if you're not involved in security, then we don't care what you think. BRI, therefore, is seen by Beijing as China's pivot to Europe and as a challenge to America's pivot to Asia. And the successful founding of the AIIB, if you remember about all the discussion in the past year or so, it's often seen as a geopolitical victory for China. In Beijing, it's not just seen as a geopolitical victory, it's seen as, again, in terms of these grand chessboard version of diplomacy, of that these countries used to be kind of allies of the US, and through AIIB and BRI, China is kind of moving them away from being US allies to be part of Beijing's orbit, into Beijing's orbit. The EU, of course, may choose to treat EU-China-US relationship geopolitically and might choose to balance with China against the global power of the US. If you're kind of a realist, that's the sort of thing you do. You kind of figure out who's strongest and you balance against them. But if we take the EU seriously as a normative power, then a different calculation is necessary. Indeed, the EU should be careful about signing up to Beijing's logic of a multipolar world, which it does in every single statement that it makes with China. It has to be careful about signing up to a multipolar world and should stress its vision of a multilateral world order. So multipolar and multilateral are completely different things, and it often gets lost in these documents. It should stress its vision of a multilateral world order that includes a wide range of non-state actors, so not just nation states. More concretely, European countries like Norway that are founding members of the AIIB should push for more transparency and accountability, which is actually in line with the EU model of an open, rule-based global order. Likewise, the EU should demand that China respect international law in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, including support for the legal arbitration of territorial disputes and for freedom of navigation. It was actually interesting that at the Shangri-La Dialogue a couple weeks ago, which is held in Singapore every year, France and the UK promised to start doing these freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. Now, France and the UK are the only countries that are able to do that. They're the only countries that have global navies in Europe. So it's quite interesting to say that they're going to do it, because up until now, it's been, I'll let the Americans do it. So I'll be curious to see how they follow through on this. At the same time, I think that the EU should pressure the US to join the AIIB and to finally ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. In this way, China would not be forced to choose, or China, in this way, the EU would not be forced to choose sides, because this is actually one of the things that they talk about in EU-China relations is, will Europe choose America or China, or we're with America now, maybe we should switch to China. My argument is not to think in those geopolitical terms, but more of a, liberal institutionalist notion of international relations, that rather than choosing sides, the EU should be promoting its vision of an open, rule-based global order against whoever. If the US is not doing the right thing, it should criticize them. If China's not doing the right thing, it should criticize them as well. This, in turn, would build up the political, security, and normative role of the EU in international relations. Europe would benefit, could even benefit economically if it's from this normative approach by making sure that BRI's investment in European infrastructure develops the goals of European integration rather than just expanding China's Sino-centric network of power. I mean, this is actually a very important thing because I know more about Southeast Asia than Europe. So in Thailand, China has kind of signed an agreement with the Thai government to build a railroad that will connect Bangkok, Kunming, Bangkok, and Singapore, which is great, but it's connecting it in the wrong way. It's going through Laos and Vientiane and northeast China, northeast Thailand, and then to Bangkok. Well, the railroad that Thailand really needs is a fast, high-speed railroad between Chiang Mai in the north and Bangkok. But that's not the railroad that China wants to build. So this is the sort of thing that you think you're getting a nice deal, but it's the wrong railroad. People have said similar things about Europe, that especially Eastern and Central European countries should be careful to not get China to build railroads to connect things within their country as part of this web network from Beijing to Western Europe, but to try and make sure that the railroads are part of a grander European integration project. So it's not just helping China, but it also helps the European integration. Otherwise, if Europe's not careful about these things, it will move from being a global center of power to be on the sidelines as merely a market on the far periphery of China's community of shared destiny. The real challenge for Europe, though, is to act with unity. Diplomats and scholars have been calling for a coherent China policy for over 15 years, but one is yet to emerge. And what we've seen is Beijing is quite adept at playing European states against each other through divide and rule tactics, whether it's as, Germany against France, or 1+5, China and the European, was it the Nordic Council, or 1+16, China and the Central and Eastern European countries. China is actually involved in trying to break up Europe diplomatically. It's quite interesting what's going on. Where am I going? So Beijing is quite adept at playing European states against each other through divide and rule tactics. While China is centralizing power around Beijing, that's the big story with Xi Jinping domestically, is the centralization of power around him and his group. Keep losing my place. While China is centralizing power, the EU is caught in an ongoing internal crisis where risks of disintegration proliferate. So now people, I guess you might know this more than me, people are starting to think beyond the vote on Thursday, and not just what happens if the UK votes to leave the European Union, but how that might encourage other countries to leave the European Union. So there's a lot of problems of kind of disintegration in Europe, whereas China is actually centralizing and re-centralizing things. So the prospect of a robust future that benefits both Europe and China, I think, is quite murky, and we should recognize that its challenges and opportunities are quite different from those of U.S.-China relations. While the EU does not have the same geopolitical gravity or weight as the U.S., its normative influence is quite strong. Since China aims to become a normative great power, the EU is well placed to influence China's future, Europe's future, and the world's future. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much for this very comprehensive, very illustrative tour of BRI, or BRI, we'll call it that as well. We're very lucky to have Professor Callahan here today. I should point out that in addition to being a very prolific author on issues related to Chinese identity, Chinese foreign policy, Chinese governance, he's also more recently been very actively involved in visual media. He has been the producer of several very interesting documentaries, the most recent being Recollecting China, Picture the Antiques Roadshow, only cooler. Definitely worth a look. And
I didn't think of that. I like that.
Yeah, wow. Okay. Yeah, well, you can borrow it. Sure.
Thanks.
Okay. And we're very happy to have him here this afternoon. So without any further ado, I would very much like to open the floor to questions. Would anyone like to start us off? Yes, in the back.
Hello, I'm Johan, also at LSE, but I spent last year in Beijing, and I have two questions kind of from my experience there at Peking University. The first was when the BRI was announced, the first thing that came to mind was not that this was an initiative from China, but more that it was a reaction to US policy, particularly TTIP and the TPP. So I was wondering, can you talk about how this grand strategy is created in response to the U.S. activities, and especially the kind of the quest for U.S. Rule setting. And then second is about your comment on the tributary system. When I was taking classes, one of my professors was responding to this initiative, saying that this was basically China making the same mistake as it did during the tributary system, where China spent a lot of resources basically giving it to this periphery, and that's ultimately what bankrupted the system, which I think is one analysis of the tributary system. So I was wondering how you could talk about how these sorts of stories also influence the One Belt Initiative in China.
Okay. Should I answer them individually? Yep. Okay, Johan, are you on the 2-year, kind of 1 year in Beijing, 1 year in the LSE? Okay. I wish we got you first before you went to China. I don't think he works at Peking University anymore, but Wang Jise used to work there, and I think now he's at the Central Party School. Wang Jise wrote in a very interesting article for the Global Times in October 2012, and the name of it is March West, or Westward March. And what Wang Jise was saying, he's like one of the top strategists in China, academic strategists anyway. And what he said is that the U.S. is sort of boxing in China along the East China Sea and the South China Sea, especially with the pivot to Asia, which had been announced about a year before that in 2011. And he said, what we should do is we should look west, and we should try and develop Central Asia and do all the things that we now talk about BRI. But what was curious is that Wang said, we can actually work with the US in Central Asia, because the US actually, I think in 2011, came up with this idea of a new Silk Road to help out Afghanistan, to develop Afghanistan economically. And so it's very curious that the US says Silk Road and then China says Silk Road. But what I guess is most curious about that article, have you seen that article, or do they talk about that? Is that whereas Wang said, forget about the coast, let's be geopolitical. There are two kind of turn of the 20th century guys who talk about geopolitics. One is Mahan, who talks about sea power. The other is Mackinder, who talks about the homeland or the home something continent, some Eurasia. The Eurasia is the pivot for everything. What Wang was doing is saying, forget about Mahan, let's go Mackinder. Let's just do this Central Asia, Eurasia strategy. What happened was Xi Jinping certainly saw that article. It was just before he was chosen or confirmed as leader of China, about a month before. And he said, that's a great idea, but I want to do the ocean thing too. So that's what is really interesting to me about BRI, is that it's, usually we think of traditional Chinese foreign policy as being very continental and focused on the Northwest and the horse nomads, the barbarians, and modern international relations as being about the sea and kind of China and Japan. What Xi Jinping has done is he says, I'm going to do both. And this, I think, explains a lot of his policy, whether it's in his head or with his group of people. He does not want to choose between one or the other. He wants to do both. He wants both development and security. He wants both continental and maritime. He wants it all. And that's, I think, what makes BRI really interesting, is it's a very grand project. Who knows whether it will work? The professor who talked about the tributary system as kind of wasted money, there's a lot of talk about that with BRI as well. Even the Wang Yiwei, the kind of young buck who is very pro BRI, his main concern is, oh my gosh, he says we're gonna give, we Chinese are benevolent, we're gonna give all these countries a lot of stuff, roads and bridges and railroads, but what if they don't buy into our version of a community of shared destiny? What if they don't follow us when we come into some struggle with the US? So there's always that risk of getting the payback from economic development projects. Yeah, BRI is very much seen as an alternative to the Trans-Pacific Partnership and TTIP. And again, that gives you a sense of what sort of rules and norms the leadership in Beijing is interested in promoting, because it criticizes the Marshall Plan, which is very odd. So it criticized the Marshall Plan as this ideological thing that divided Europe. So rather than America helping rebuild Europe after World War II, they say, well, you didn't help Eastern Europe. Of course, there was a geopolitical calculation there, but it's quite curious that before that, I had never heard anybody criticize the Marshall Plan. Also, they criticize Trans-Pacific Partnership for being about rules and regulations and saying this is too stiff, and that China is better because it's open and it's flexible, and that each deal will be made on its own merits. So if you like that, that's fine, but it seems to be arguing against the way European integration has worked. European integration is all about rules and regulations. It's all about, Brussels deciding on how things should work, and then national governments having to integrate that into their domestic legislation. So this is kind of another distinction between them. Okay, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Ren.
Thank you so much, Bill, for this very interesting presentation, and also for a new unforgettable acronym. I'm excited to use that now and to not have to deal with OBOR anymore. I'm curious to hear a little bit more.
Sounds really ominous.
Sounds very Norwegian. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the regional context in East Asia, to hear about the reactions of East Asian states towards BRI. Looking at the veins of BRI, they're all heading in directions away from East Asia. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the reception of that, and particularly maybe how East Asian states perceive BRI's extension into Southeast Asia.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Even if you look on this map, it's kind of, we don't care about Japan. South Korea and China are still quite close, so, but it was sort of like, they were like, hey, what about us? So now they're doing something with them. Japan, it was very curious because China came out with this BRI idea at the same time that it was challenging Japan in the East China Sea on a daily basis. And I was talking to this is, again, London, Japanese diplomats come, they take me out to a nice Japanese meal, we chat. They told me they were really perplexed about why China came to them with this BRI thing as an opportunity. At the same time, they're basically attacking them. Says, why should Japan cooperate with China on anything while it's actually in a security competition? So that was a Japanese diplomatic point of view. Japan has actually been trying to have kind of BRI alternatives because Japan in the 1980s was very effective at doing what BRI now wants to do, at building infrastructure, and building infrastructure that fit into the regionalization of the Japanese economy. Because Japan faced similar problems in the 1980s that China has faced for the past few years of overcapacity. And then there was the Plaza Accords, and then they had to kind of get out of Japan and start making things in Thailand and Malaysia and Cambodia later. And they're very successful. I mean, I have relatives in Thailand, so I go there every Christmas and New Year's, and we go to a beach house and in kind of east of Bangkok, and that's where a lot of the infrastructure was built, the Japanese infrastructure, and that's where a lot of the Japanese factories are. So there's a whole bunch of middle-class Japanese people living there, and they actually have a Japantown out in the middle of nowhere. And so that's exactly what China wants. It wants to have this sort of cultural and economic and political influence. Japan has been saying that it's going to do the similar things again, of building infrastructure, especially in Southeast Asia. What is, I guess, interesting, when I was talking to my IR colleagues in Bangkok in January, I talked to 3 of them in one day at Chulalongkorn University, so a very conservative mainstream university. Some people who are experts in Thai foreign policy, other people who do Southeast Asian foreign policy, another person who does Chinese foreign policy. Each of them separately compared the BRI to the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, okay? And so that tells you everything you need to know.
Okay, I see more hands going up. Maybe I'll take 2 at a time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I was intrigued by this comparison between Europe and China, in the sense that you said that both of them are projects evolving, fearful of being disintegrating, but at the same time uncertain about the identity. Now, if you look at the history of European integration during the last 50 years, there's been some big projects and some setbacks. And I just wonder, for this BRI project, it would be critical to kind of get the ball rolling, to get some success stories early on, right? So what should we look particular for? What would be the kind of critical cases, whether this will be successful or not? So that's the first question. The second question is, China is not kind of moving into this region, and it's not like a vacuum. There are other players there as well. And you didn't say anything about Russia. How do you see the relationship between Russia and China evolving in this Central Asian region? Thank you.
Okay.
Russia is quite the big deal around here, as you might imagine.
Yes.
Okay, and the next gentleman in the chair.
Now it's on. Following up on the, in a sense, drawing the map and the interconnections there, I was also quite intrigued with the Southeast Asian connections. And there are a number of infrastructure discussions within ASEAN itself, which the connections to China then obviously plays into. Whether you'll have one or two railways is still an open question. I mean, you could easily get a Bangkok, Chiang Mai, Chiang Rai, Kunming railway, as well as one that goes through Laos. And there's also, so it's fascinating to analyze the kind of maps that you have, because they are not really cut in stone. There would, at any point in time, be the possibility to add on or subtract different new pipelines and different railroads and different road connections. One obvious one that's not mapped here, which is talked about from time to time, is the railway from Lhasa through Nepal to India. And it's not something that's on the final design stages, but it's coming up in the discussions between China and Nepal and India on and off. So it's not a very new idea, but it's an idea that has not been realized. But obviously, depending on the geopolitical relationships between China and India, that could or could not be possible. It's technically difficult, but not impossible. Could I just ask you a couple of questions on conceptual clarifications? Socialize. Can you define how you use that word? Because the way you used it gives me the impression that it's slightly different from the use of the word socialization in some Asian countries. And then the neighborhood versus periphery. Some of the confusion using those concepts is probably relating to the fact that China, as other big powers, United States, tends to have different an analysis of periphery as a continuum. So it's the concentric circles. It's the neighborhood are those who are closest. That's the closest periphery, and then you get peripheries that are further away. And so the sort of concentric circle argument is probably giving you a better conceptualization of that. For instance, you mentioned the notion that China would not see Europe or the EU as an important security actor. And that's precisely because China defines its security interests as primarily regional and not global. If China at some point in the future would have more of a global security conceptualization, then obviously the EU would be more central to that. But there's some conceptualization issues that it would be interesting for you if you could clarify that.
Thank you.
Okay. Russia, Putin was really pissed off with Xi Jinping. He said, hey, we're bros. Why aren't you including me in BRI? And it seemed to be very much about China going around, taking a southern route around Russia and not dealing with Russia and sort of seeing Russia as a competitor. China's response to Russian complaints is, okay, we'll include you. So like you're saying, it's very flexible. And so now one of the railroads is going to go through Moscow, or it's probably the same, the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And yeah, Russia is a very big factor. It's like in a lot of Chinese foreign policy, they don't sort of name their competitors. They just do stuff and wait for the competitor to react. I was reading something last night or the day before about how in Central Asia, Russia still, correct me if I'm wrong, Russia still has close political and security relations with a lot of the former Soviet republics, and therefore China has then a kind of a Central Asian paradox as well as an East Asian paradox that China is very important to Central Asian countries economically, but security they still would rather be with Russia, with Moscow, than with Beijing. Yeah, I guess I'll have to think some more about how Russia fits in. The success stories, you're right. It's not that they'll have to point to success stories in the future. What has happened with this project is that China has often just rebranded already existing projects. And it's not just China, other countries do this too. So China has rebranded this corridor here as a Belt Road Initiative project, even though it's been going on for five or more years. I think they're almost done constructing the port at Gwadar. They've already had a lot of pipelines with Central Asian countries, and they already have a railroad going to Madrid. It's already there. It's already a success. So that's you're exactly right. They're celebrating the successes of the Belt Road Initiative, even though they predate the Belt Road Initiative. But I don't see there's necessarily a political problem with that. I think now what's happening is China has often been pleasantly surprised at how successful its initiatives have been over the past 15 years. Another example is the Confucius Institutes. When they started them in 2004, they had a very modest goal of having maybe 20 Confucius Institutes by 6 years later in 2010. Now they have, I think, 400 or 500, who knows what the count is, about 500 Confucius Institutes around the world. And so China is much more successful at these projects than it anticipates. It also means that they don't really have the capacity to build Confucius Institutes any more than they have the capacity to build all the bridges that people want them to build. So that's actually where the politics comes in of which bridges and which pipelines and which ports it chooses to build. So that's going to be quite interesting because if you see this from outside China, it can lead to a lot of not just gratefulness. I mean, in China, often things are talked about grateful. So Tibetans are seen as ungrateful. You know, that Beijing gave them all this stuff, and they just are not cooperating. They're ungrateful. So the same thing I think is going to go on in Southeast Asia and East Asia is whether these countries will be grateful enough, or whether they'll say, "Hey, you didn't give us as much as you promised." So it's this sort of this economic and moral and personal, because everything gets personalized. So it's very curious. Anyway. I can't really say about an alternative route through Thailand. I can only say this is the route that people are talking about now. And people in Thailand aren't happy. People in Beijing are not happy. They're saying Thailand's ungrateful. So it's this weird thing that once you start being benevolent, then you have to worry about people thinking you're being too cheap. Lost in Nepal, India, again, that's very interesting. I imagine this is where I would put my geopolitical hat on, and I imagine you say there's no way they want to have a railroad to the border, because the main purpose of the Xining Lhasa Railroad is military, okay? It's to bring the troops into Tibet. And there's been the military, the construction of military infrastructure along the border, the Chinese side of the border has been really fantastic. And that's the main weakness of India, is that they just don't have the infrastructure to get their troops, as well as it being higher and lower. But I imagine that would be a hard sell in India. Concept of socialization. I guess in international relations, socialization is sort of the soft power. That's how I'm using it. Or Ian Johnston wrote a book about social states and about how Chinese diplomats were socialized in 4 stages into kind of signing on to global norms. And that's, I guess, how I'm using it. Neighborhood diplomacy, peripheral. I guess this is where I'm an old-fashioned pedantic sinologist. I think if you want to say neighborhood, it should be Linju, okay? If you want to say periphery, it's Jobian. They're different. They're different words, different concepts. And you should not mix them up, or mix them up at your peril. Concentric circles. Sure, that's the way I often talk to students about Chinese foreign policy. It's not about borders, it's about concentric circles, certainly.
Okay. Yes, Björnar.
Hi, Björn Sverre Tygsson, studying at the LSE, as you might be aware of. Again, thanks a lot, Bill, for coming here and having a really interesting presentation. I'm quite fascinated by those sort of normative and civilizational linkages between Europe. But there is, because we've been discussing a good bit what's been happening here now on the eastern end of the Eurasian continent. But sitting in Oslo, as we are currently now, the one thing that sort of strikes me about this really cool map is the fact that, yeah, you can sort of vaguely see Kristiansand and then the whole of Norway just disappears. It's not there. So
It's a German map, though. It's not a Chinese map.
right, but that's the thing, because I've seen a couple of Chinese maps and they're pretty similar to this one.
Okay.
So how do you think this new massive BRI project would affect the Nordic countries in general and Norway in particular? And also, I mean, given that we have Mark and you and Mark on the same stage here, because at one point there was a lot of talk about the sort of the third road around the polar one, which of course we like a heck of a lot better because that would make us relevant. And what is happening with that one now? How is it being talked about in China these days? Because it seemed to have gotten in a bit of a lull. And what's the sort of dynamic between those potential three roads?
Okay, thank you. Was there another hand up? Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you again for a very interesting talk. I would like to come back to the Russian question, if I may, in some more detail. In Russia now, China is looked upon as a very, by many people, by some people at least, as a very active and very greedy claimer of natural resources, which Russia gets very little back for. Could you please comment on how Russia is really regarded in China?
Thank you.
When I was last in Oslo in November, I was asked to give a talk about China's futures and about ideas and sort of the China world or China dream, world dream, stuff that kind of brief fits into that as an intermediate stage. And I also talked about how in China it's very common to people to think about leadership in terms of generations, with Mao as the first generation and Xi Jinping as the fifth generation, and that how the experience of the fifth generation leadership is quite unique, that they're the red aristocracy or the sons and daughters of the actual revolutionaries. They're born generally in the early 1950s. They grew up in gated communities with the communist elite. Then in the 60s, they suffered during the Cultural Revolution. I mean, some of them suffered really badly, including Xi Jinping. And then now they're in leadership, and that has shaped the way they think in terms of struggle. Struggle is a live or die thing. And I also thought that rather than comparing Xi Jinping to Mao, we should think of Xi Jinping and Putin. That Xi Jinping's first foreign trip was to Moscow. He spoke at the equivalent of the LSE, the Moscow Institute for International whatever Studies. And that he has actually Xi has been learning from Putin about how to be a good leader, how to be a good autocratic leader, to not just to try and reach out to the people. Earlier we were talking about Putin's very good at public relations and speaking to the West. Xi Jinping has been kind of learning from Putin and others about how he has to be a different kind of leader from Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao is a very formal, you wouldn't want to go out and have a beer with him, right? Xi Jinping has said, let's have noodles, or let's have dumplings. That was one of his big propaganda things in his first year. And people like it. They call him Xi Dada, kind of Uncle Xi or Papa Xi. And so there is this linkage between them. They have the same temperament. They have the same shared suspicion to liberalism and to the West in general. But beyond this personal tie, I guess I would say that China still sees Russia as an example, but not as a positive example, as a negative example. Over the past 2 decades, there have been numerous very well-funded studies about why the Communist Party of the Soviet Union collapsed. And the purpose of this is very policy relevant. It's like, oh my gosh, we have to make sure the Chinese Communist Party doesn't collapse like that. So this is one of the reasons that Xi Jinping has this anti-corruption drive, because he thinks that's one of the things that undermine the CPSU. This is why Xi Jinping wants to be a strong man. He said very clearly that the reason why Russia or the Soviet Union disintegrated is because people weren't manly enough, very gendered language. You have to man up to defend the nation and defend the party, actually, and then the nation. So Russia is seen as a negative example politically, and it's also seen as a negative example economically of, again, what not to do. So I can understand, did I do something wrong? I can understand why, Russians are kind of annoyed with China because they think that China is ungrateful, or they're used to seeing China as a younger brother in the communist hierarchy. One of the things in making these films that Mark mentioned, one of the things I've been looking at is posters, propaganda posters from China, and especially ones from the 1950s show Russians, because there were like, I don't know how many, maybe 1 million Russians went to China to help out, engineers and scientists to help build the People's Republic of China in the 1950s. And so they had propaganda posters to commemorate this. And it's really fascinating that the Russians are about this much taller than the Chinese, even though if you're in northern China, they're really tall. So it's very much, they saw themselves as younger brothers or as children. And one of Mao's early kind of futuristic aphorisms was not China is the future, but the Soviet, let's see, the Soviet Union's today is, no, Soviet Union, anyway, that Soviet Union is first and we're second. If we want to look to the future, look at the Soviet Union. Oh, Soviet Union's today is China's tomorrow, something to that effect. So this, in Russia, they're used to this being treated nicely, and so it's not surprising that they see China as greedy. Bjornar, yeah, I think you probably know more about it than I do, but as well as the maritime Silk Road and the continental Silk Road, they talk about two other Silk Roads, the Polar Silk Road and the Cyber Silk Road. So we should think that they really are thinking kind of futuristically in sort of fourth dimension or fifth dimension. But I haven't read, because I don't study sort of Arctic studies, I haven't gone beyond what the generalists say. So Wang Yiwei and Zheng Yongnian and that group of people who don't know anything about the North Pole, they still always mention this Arctic route as the new belt. So it's in the consciousness, but I don't know how far it's in the policy.
Thank you. I'll just add very briefly to Bjornar's question about the so-called ice road or the polar road. This is, compared to BRI as a whole, this is something which China is looking at in a much longer time scale. Like, for all the talk about the Arctic being a source of widespread shipping, the number of ships that made the run through the Northern Sea Route this summer went down considerably. I think it was about 13. Which really reflects the kind of unpredictability of the weather, the conditions, and so forth. And there are very few in China who are anticipating massive amounts of ships being sent through anytime soon. But when we talk about 20 years, 50 years down the line, China certainly does see that region as being extremely important to future shipping between Asia and Europe. And certainly the Nordic states will be a very important part of that. But this definitely takes on a more long-term situation. Okay, we have time for maybe one
And
more.
actually,
Yep.
I think if you want to see how Norway fits into BRI, just look to what happened, as I said, last October when Xi Jinping went to Manchester. That it doesn't have to be some continental connection. It's whoever wants to be involved in BRI can. So now Latin America is getting involved in BRI. So if the Norwegian government or Norwegian industry wants to take advantage of it, it's there for the taking.
Okay, I saw 2 hands go up, so if we can keep the questions very short. The gentleman in the front.
Can I get some more water?
You hinted very briefly at some people have tried to compare the Chinese notion of community of shared destiny with the Japanese concept of the Asian co-prosperity sphere. One was in the first half of the 20th century, and the other one is now in the beginning of the 21st century. So, of course, the Japanese notion of the co-prosperity sphere came to an explosion in Pearl Harbor, as we know, in December 1941. Are you seeing any forthcoming explosion anywhere in the continuation of the development of the community of shared destiny in Asia now?
Okay, thank you, sir. And our last question, gentleman in the back.
Yewen Jing from Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. How has the private sectors or the enterprises from China followed the BRI initiative in terms of the co-investment or going with the direction to the infrastructure building and investment along the plan? And looking at China's foreign investment at a larger scale, we also see that the purchases of enterprises like AMC in the US and hotels and ports in Greece. And so this is a large amount and seemingly increasing purchases of from soccer clubs to production facilities, and considering this also enormous amount of investment for the BRI initiative, do you then, considering China's slowing economic growth and the uncertainty about its economic future, do you think China has the strength to or to continue this on top of the economic uncertainty domestically and the increasing investment internationally? Thanks.
Sure. Thank you. Okay. Explosive question. That's a really interesting thing. I guess I'm not suggesting that BRI is the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. What I was saying is that a bunch of public intellectuals in Southeast Asia, a politician in India, Shashi Tharoor, said the same thing, have been comparing it to the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. And this goes back to what I was saying about the tributary states. In China, they see this imperial history as this great thing that worked really well, not just for China, but for the region. And they think that BRI is going to work really well. China's generous. Who could be against that? My point is that you can never predict when you're at the center, whether you're in Beijing or London or Washington, how other countries are going to react to your policies. And so I'm not surprised that a bunch of people are making this analogy with this kind of horrible imperial Japanese, very manipulative form of regionalism. And I guess in China, I wish they would pay more attention to this. My experience is when this sort of thing comes up, they just say, "Oh, those are horrible people who are thinking in the wrong way," rather than saying, "Oh, why are they thinking that there might be that China's BRI might be like the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere." I guess you're probably leading about whether there's going to be some naval battle between the U.S. and China in the South China Sea. And I think there will be, actually. I think there's going to be a confrontation very soon. And it's going to be very dangerous because it could spread out of control very quickly. And a lot of people have been criticizing Obama for not being strong enough in South China Sea and other places. And there's this growing chorus in the U.S. that it's better to stand up to China now than later. And in Beijing, you hear similar things, that like this is China's opportunity, that China needs to sprint to the finish to take the prize of being the leader of the world. Not everybody says that, but there's a very vocal and growing group. So that's what I worry about, is that these sort of military geopoliticians, do we call them that? Geopolitical people are kind of, their voices are getting stronger, and it could lead to big problems. I guess we'll see what happens in China's response to the legal decision that will probably go in the Philippines' favor, this month. The other question about China's companies, they're mostly state-owned enterprises, which are a target of reform, economic reform in China again. And the BRI and AIIB were designed basically to solve the problem of the SOEs, solve the overcapacity. What the heck are we going to do with all this cement and steel? We can't just keep dumping it on the world market, because then we piss off the UK. Because the steel foundries in Wales are closing, and is seen as a direct, then they're blaming China for overproducing and dumping steel. So one of the ways of dealing with this is to just keep building stuff. In the positive sense, China presents itself to the world as very, very capable of building infrastructure projects, and it's true. They're very good. China's very good at building high-speed rail. It's very good at building bridges and roads and ports. So why not help? But it's dealing with the not just internationally, but with the state-owned enterprises at home. You mentioned that China is increasingly starting to buy stuff abroad. That, again, is part of diversifying China's foreign exchange reserves. So it's no longer just buying T-bills. It's investing in BRI, but it's also buying theater chains in the U.S. I think that is to be expected. That's certainly what the U.S. does, and that's what Japan did starting in the 1980s. It sometimes causes some cultural frictions. In the 1980s, there was a lot of anti-Japanese feeling in the U.S. because they were, buying up Rockefeller Center and things like that. I'm not surprised that the same sort of thing happens with China, but I don't really see it as a big problem. I just see that happening. The last question was about whether China can afford to do BRI, and that is, I think, the $64,000 question. That's the real question. China has all these great ideas, has all these great institutions. Does it have the money? And increasingly, it doesn't. And that's the real concern in Beijing, is about China's been spending its foreign exchange reserves to support the yuan for the past year. And the foreign exchange reserves, I don't know the latest figures, but they were down by 20% in under a year, which just shows that China, or that the banking authorities in China can't keep this policy going of supporting the yuan. They have to do something, or else they'll end up with no money. But I'm not a political economist, so I can't really say more than that.
Okay, excellent. This was fantastic. Thank you very much again for your really illuminating, really comprehensive presentation.
Comprehensive is Xi Jinping's word.
Yes, okay, good call. So thank you all very much for coming. Like I said, this is part of an ongoing speaker series related to Nordic-China affairs. So please keep an eye out on the NUPI website for future events coming up in the autumn. And will everyone please join me in thanking Professor Callahan.